Hey guys, welcome to our channel where we love to make the scripture come alive for your edification. We're asking that you kindly subscribe so you can get notified every time we upload a new video. Also, remember to like and share these videos with your friends and family. And if you have a comment or a prayer request, please write them down in the comments section below because we want to hear from you and also keep you in prayer. Thank you so much for doing that. And now, let's dive right in. Alright guys, this is the full video. Alright, listen carefully. You've heard the expression, do as I say, not as I do. Well, the religious leaders of Jesus' day were masters at that. And their hypocrisy really grated on Jesus, so much so that he launched a blistering attack against them, which we find in Matthew chapter 7 verses 13 through 29. Let's set the stage by hearing from the narrator. Enter a group of religious leaders, Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, and so on. They're all sitting in the seats of the scribes, meaning they're in positions of religious authority. Now, who does Jesus compare them to? He compares them to whitewashed tombs that look nice on the outside, but inside are really filthy. In fact, those tombs were used by the religious leaders of that day to store their dead. So Jesus is saying these guys may look holy on the outside, but inside they're filthy. Their insides are filled with hypocrisy and wickedness. That's the impression Jesus wants his disciples to have of these people. Now, what are they doing when Jesus says this? What's the context? The context is they are devouring the property of widows under the guise of prayer. So they pray long prayers to cover up their sin, thinking that the longer the prayer, the more pious they appear. But Jesus says that's just a smokescreen to cover up their sin. So what's the bottom line here? People can abuse spiritual practices for selfish purposes. Spiritual disciplines like prayer and fasting aren't bad, but they can become hypocritical if they're done to cover up sin or to impress people. And that's the point Jesus is making here. So how does Jesus expose their hypocrisy? He exposes it with a series of woes. Now, these are woes of judgment, but notice what he focuses on. He focuses on their love for the best seats, their desire to be seen by people, their love for greetings, their love for the best food, their love for fine clothing. In other words, Jesus is saying that these guys are all about status and appearances. They want the best seats in the synagogue. They want to be seen in the marketplaces. They want the best food and the finest clothes. In other words, they want people to see them and acknowledge them and praise them and admire them. And Jesus says, hey, my disciples, don't be like these people, because ultimately, it's not about outward appearances. It's about what's in here that counts. So he makes that declaration, and then he gives them a practical application of that principle. Now, one of the things that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were notorious for was their inability to see beyond their noses. They were legalistic. They had all these rules and regulations. They had all these man-made traditions, and they were so caught up in all of that they couldn't see the big picture. They couldn't see the main thing. And Jesus calls attention to that right here. He says, stop judging that splinter in your brother's eye. And look, there's a plank in your own eye. In other words, don't go around pointing out the faults in other people when you yourself have faults that are far worse. So again, the key point here is that these religious leaders were blind to their own faults. They couldn't see their own faults because they were so focused on the faults of other people. So what was the result? Jesus says they strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. What does that mean? Gnats were small flies, and camels were large. So they would strain to remove a little gnat from their drink, but they wouldn't bother to remove the camel. In other words, they were concerned with the little things, but not the big things. They paid attention to details that didn't really matter, but they ignored the big picture. So the point Jesus is making is that these religious leaders were legalistic, they were blind to their own faults, and they were hypocritical. And then in verse 29, Jesus makes a final assessment of these people. He says, "Why do you not see that the one who makes the speck has need to remove the plank from his own eye, lest he himself also be blinded?" So the question is, can we learn from this passage? Yes, we can. The lesson is this: don't be like the religious leaders of Jesus' day. Don't be hypocritical. Don't be legalistic. And don't be blind to your own faults. So guys, I hope you found that helpful. Please write down in the comments any thoughts you might have, and we will see you in the next video. Judge not, lest ye be judged.